Fooling Some of the People All of the Time by David Einhorn. Picture this. You're about to give a speech in front of some of the smartest people in finance. But this isn't just any presentation. It's for a charity helping children with cancer. And the organizers have one simple request. Share your absolute best investment idea. Now, most people would talk about a winner, a company poised for greatness, a stock ready to explode. But on May 15, 2002, a young hedge fund manager named David Einhorn took a completely different approach. He didn't pitch a company he loved. Instead, he presented a company he believed was a complete fraud, a company called Allied Capital that most people in that room had never even heard of. He methodically laid out exactly why he was betting against it. The market had already closed. But the next morning, when the opening bell rang at the New York Stock Exchange, something remarkable happened. Allied Capital's stock didn't even open for trading. So many people were trying to dump their shares that the system completely jammed. When trading finally started, the stock had crashed by 20%. That single speech ignited a fire that would burn for 6 years. It launched David Einhorn into an exhausting battle, not just against one dishonest company, but against an entire system that seemed built to protect it. He fought Wall Street analysts, powerful PR firms, and even the very government regulators who were supposed to be protecting investors. This isn't just about stocks and spreadsheets. It's a real-life financial detective story about integrity, persistence, and the staggering price of telling the truth when nobody wants to hear it. Today, we're diving into this masterpiece of investigative finance, fooling some of the people all of the time. By the end, you'll understand not only how one man uncovered a massive fraud hiding in plain sight, but you'll gain insider knowledge about how high finance really works and what happens when the watchdogs fall asleep on the job. Our story starts with an act of charity. David Einhorn, founder of Greenlight Capital, wasn't yet a household name, but in certain circles, he was known for his incredibly detailed and disciplined approach to investing. When invited to speak at the Tomorrow's Children's Fund conference, he wanted to give the audience something genuine, something that truly showcased his best work. At that moment, his most compelling idea was his bet against Allied Capital. Betting against a company is called short selling. The concept is straightforward. Instead of buying a stock hoping it goes up, you borrow someone else's shares, sell them, and hope the price drops. If it does, you buy the shares back at the lower price, return them to the lender, and pocket the difference as profit. It's essentially profiting from a company's decline. But Einhorn wasn't just guessing Allied would decline. He believed he'd found concrete evidence that the company was fundamentally dishonest in how it presented its finances to the world. So what exactly was Allied Capital? It was a special type of company called a business development company, or BDC. Think of it as a publicly traded private equity firm. It would take money from public investors and lend it to small, private businesses. In return, Allied would collect interest and fees. For decades, it had been a reliable investment, paying steady and rising dividends to shareholders, mostly regular folks and retirees who depended on that income. On the surface, everything looked perfect, but Einhorn and his team started digging deeper. They did something few others bothered to do. They built a massive database tracking every single loan Allied had ever made, quarter by quarter, for years. As they sifted through the data, a disturbing pattern emerged. Imagine you lend money to a friend's startup. Along with the loan, your friend gives you a small piece of the company's stock, what Wall Street calls an equity kicker. At first, everything's going well, but then you start hearing bad news. The startup isn't performing as planned. Logically, you'd think, if the company's stock is worth less, then my loan is riskier, so it's also worth less. But that's not what Allied did. Einhorn discovered that when one of their investments got into trouble, Allied would reduce the value of the small stock portion, the equity kicker. But they'd keep valuing the loan itself at full value. They pretended the loan was still perfectly safe, even when they had clear evidence the company was struggling. It was their way of hiding bad news. They were consistently slow to admit when investments were going bad. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a systematic approach to making their portfolio look healthier than it really was. Einhorn decided to call the company directly. He and his analyst, James Lynn, got on the phone with Allied's Investor Relations Department. Einhorn asked a simple question: how do you decide what your investments are worth? The response was revealing. Allied's representative described what she called a mosaic theory of valuation. She said it wasn't strictly quantitative. Then she said something that made Einhorn's ears perk up. Unlike banks, Allied didn't have regulators pushing them to write off troubled assets. They only wrote down an investment when they believed there was a permanent impairment. This was the smoking gun. Financial rules for a company like Allied require fair value accounting. That means you value your assets based on what they're worth today, what a willing buyer would pay for them in the market right now. But Allied was using a different approach, an approach Einhorn would later call the "you have got to be kidding me" method of accounting. They were essentially saying, even if this loan is in trouble, as long as we hope we'll eventually get our original investment back someday, we don't have to mark it down. It was a complete violation of the rules. It allowed them to hide their problems and keep their financial statements looking smooth and stable. Einhorn and his team found even more evidence. They examined some of Allied's investments in publicly traded companies, where market prices were visible to everyone. In several cases, Allied was carrying these investments on its books at prices far above where they were actually trading. When questioned about this, Allied's CFO claimed that any trades in those bonds were just fire sales by distressed sellers and didn't reflect true long-term value. It was another lie. The bonds were trading actively, and the market price was the real price. Allied just didn't like what it showed. Armed with this mountain of evidence, Einhorn felt he had no choice but to share his findings at the charity conference. He laid out the case, piece by piece. He explained the valuation games, the delayed write-downs, and the overvalued public securities. The market reacted dramatically. The stock plunged. But the story was just beginning. Allied didn't respond by correcting its practices. Instead, it attacked the messenger. The morning after the speech, Allied's CEO, Bill Walton, held a conference call. He accused Einhorn of running a campaign of misinformation for personal profit. He claimed Einhorn hadn't even bothered to talk to management, a claim that was provably false, since Einhorn had spent hours on the phone with them. Then the Wall Street machine kicked into high gear. Merrill Lynch, Allied's investment banker, published a report defending the company. Their analyst wrote that Allied was required to mark its investments to long-term value, not mark-to-market. This was completely wrong. There's no such thing as long-term value accounting for a BDC. It was a made-up concept designed to justify Allied's behavior. Another analyst from Wachovia rushed out a strong buy rating, claiming Einhorn hadn't raised anything new. When Einhorn got him on the phone, the analyst admitted that some of Allied's valuations were almost indefensible, but he still trusted management. Why? Because Allied's chief operating officer, Joan Sweeney, used to work at the SEC's Division of Enforcement. The implication was clear. Someone with her background wouldn't break the rules, or more cynically, would know how to get away with it. Einhorn was facing a wall of denial. He was a lone voice against a powerful company, its highly paid bankers, and a chorus of analysts who seemed more interested in protecting their relationships than finding the truth. But the story was about to get much darker. Einhorn's investigation had only scratched the surface. The real rot at Allied's heart wasn't just creative accounting. It was in their largest and most important investment, a subsidiary called Business Loan Express, or BLX. What Einhorn and others would uncover wasn't just rule-bending, but outright fraud against American taxpayers. BLX made loans to small businesses under the Small Business Administration, or SBA, program. The SBA is a government agency that guarantees a large portion, typically 75% of these loans. The idea is to encourage lending to small businesses that might not otherwise qualify. But that government guarantee creates a dangerous incentive. If a lender knows taxpayers will cover most losses, they might not be as careful about who they lend to. And BLX was anything but careful. Another investor, Jim Carruthers, who was masterful at digging through public records, started finding lawsuits related to BLX loans. The stories he uncovered were shocking. He found a case where BLX gave an SBA guaranteed loan to a woman to build car washes, even though she had a previous federal criminal conviction for embezzlement. When she defaulted, BLX executives helped her get more fraudulent loans in family members' names to cover up the losses. He found gas station loans where appraisals were inflated to 3 times actual value, given to borrowers with no business experience, who never made a single payment. It was a clear pattern. But the full picture came into focus when Einhorn obtained a special report from BankLab, a firm that tracked all SBA loan performance. The report was devastating. It showed that BLX's loans defaulted at a rate nearly 3 times higher than the average SBA loan. This wasn't just a few bad apples. This was systemic. Then, a former senior vice president from BLX reached out to Einhorn. He'd seen Einhorn's research online and wanted to talk. He told Einhorn that BLX's culture was all about speed and volume. The company's goal was to churn out as many loans as possible, as fast as possible, because that's how they booked profits. Underwriting standards were practically non-existent. They hired underwriters with no lending experience. They didn't properly check borrowers' credit or collateral. And the head of BLX's top-producing office, a man named Matthew McGee, was a convicted felon who'd spent time in prison for securities fraud. BLX was essentially a machine designed to create bad loans, pass most of the risk to taxpayers, and book phony profits using aggressive gain-on-sale accounting. Einhorn now understood the problem at Allied was much bigger than he'd first thought. Allied wasn't just overvaluing a few investments. Its single largest investment, BLX, was a massive fraud. And the income Allied was reporting from BLX, the income it used to justify its ever-rising dividend, was completely fictitious. It was a circular flow of money. Allied would lend money to BLX, which BLX would use to pay interest and fees back to Allied. Allied would book this as income, while the hole at BLX just got deeper. It was a classic pyramid scheme. As long as Allied could keep raising new money from unsuspecting investors by selling new stock, they could keep the game going. With this explosive new information, Einhorn realized he had to get the story to people who could do something about it. He took his findings to the regulators. He went to the SBA's Office of Inspector General, the internal watchdog responsible for investigating fraud in the program. He laid out the evidence of fraudulent loans. The response was underwhelming. They asked if he had the official SBA loan numbers. When he said he didn't, they seemed uninterested in finding them. One official said, "We see this all the time." They knew rules were being broken but seemed unwilling or unable to act. Next, Einhorn went to the SEC, Wall Street's top cop. He laid out not only the fraud at BLX, but also Allied's own accounting manipulations. He met with enforcement attorneys who seemed engaged and took detailed notes. He left feeling that finally someone was listening. He was wrong. A few months later, in January 2003, the Wall Street Journal published an article reporting that the SEC and New York Attorney General Eliot Spitzer were launching an investigation. But they weren't investigating Allied Capital. They were investigating David Einhorn. Allied had successfully convinced regulators that Einhorn was the bad guy. They claimed he was part of a conspiracy of short sellers trying to manipulate the market. The very people who should have been investigating the crime were now investigating the person who reported it. The next 2 years were a surreal nightmare for Einhorn. He was forced to hire lawyers, turn over years of emails and trading records, and sit for 2 days of grueling testimony at SEC headquarters. One SEC lawyer, Mark Braswell, was openly hostile, acting as the bad cop, relentlessly questioning Einhorn's motives and trying to get him to admit he was just trying to drive the stock down for personal gain. While the government was busy investigating Einhorn, Allied's charade continued, but pressure was mounting. In response to scrutiny, Allied began subtly changing its accounting. It started taking more write-downs, but also started finding more write-ups to offset them, keeping reported earnings smooth. The company that had once prided itself on predictable operating income now shifted its story, telling investors to focus on capital gains instead. Then came the most brazen act of all. The company started a campaign of what can only be described as corporate espionage. One day, Einhorn got a call from a journalist who told him to check his phone bill online. The journalist, Herb Greenberg, had been writing critical articles about Allied and discovered that someone had illegally accessed his phone records by creating a fake online account. Einhorn checked his own records, first his cell phone, nothing, then his home long-distance provider, AT&T, access denied. Someone had already created an online account in his wife's name. They'd been spied on. It turned out he wasn't alone. Jim Carruthers, the investigator who'd done so much digging into BLX, had his records stolen. So did another analyst who'd written a negative report. The only thing they all had in common was their criticism of Allied Capital. Einhorn wrote a letter to Allied's board of directors, informing them of the fraud at BLX, the pattern of dishonesty from management, and the fact that their agents were engaged in criminal activity. The board's response was a dismissive letter saying they'd asked management and found no evidence to support his claims. They were turning a blind eye. For years, the stalemate continued. Einhorn kept digging, kept finding more evidence, and kept feeding it to authorities who seemed to move at a glacial pace, if at all. The media mostly treated it as a he-said-she-said story, a battle between a company and a rabble-rousing short seller. And then everything changed. The financial crisis of 2008 hit. The credit bubble that had propped up so many weak companies burst. For years, Allied had papered over its problems by raising more and more money from public markets. But now that spigot was turned off. Suddenly, the house of cards began collapsing. In September 2008, BLX, Allied's prized cash cow, filed for bankruptcy. The bankruptcy filings revealed the truth Einhorn had been shouting about for years. BLX generated no cash flow at all. It was worthless. Allied was forced to write off its entire investment and make good on hundreds of millions of dollars in loan guarantees it had provided to BLX's banks. The losses were catastrophic. The stock, which had traded as high as $30 a share, collapsed. It fell to $5, then $2, then for a time, to just 59 cents a share. The dividend, the sacred cow that management had protected for decades, was eliminated. Finally, after nearly 7 years of fighting, David Einhorn was vindicated. Everything he'd said in that charity speech in 2002, and everything he'd uncovered since, had been proven true. But it was a strange kind of victory. Yes, the company had collapsed, but the system that enabled it remained largely unchanged. In 2007, the SEC finally concluded its investigation into Allied. It found that the company had violated securities laws by failing to keep proper records and maintain internal controls for valuing investments. The punishment? A simple cease and desist order. No fines, no penalties, no action against any individual manager or director. As Einhorn describes it, the lightest tap on the wrist with the softest of feathers. Even more astonishing, a later report by the SEC's own Inspector General revealed that the SEC had initially failed to investigate Allied's accounting and instead focused on investigating Einhorn at Allied's urging. It confirmed that the SEC examiner who did look into Allied believed the company's financing of its dividend was akin to a Ponzi scheme, but the enforcement division never followed up. And what about Mark Braswell, the aggressive SEC lawyer who'd grilled Einhorn? He left the SEC shortly after the testimony and, in an almost unbelievable twist, became a registered lobbyist for Allied Capital. In the end, Allied Capital was sold to another company for a fraction of its former value. Bill Walton and Joan Sweeney, the executives who presided over the fraud, walked away with millions they'd made over the years. No one went to jail for the massive fraud at BLX or the accounting lies at Allied. The gatekeepers who had failed, the analysts, the auditors, the regulators, suffered no consequences. The story was over, but the questions it raised are more important today than ever. When you finish a book like Fooling Some of the People All of the Time, it's easy to feel frustrated, maybe even a bit cynical. Here's a story where one person, through sheer diligence and intellectual honesty, uncovers a massive, multi-year fraud. He does everything right. He documents his findings, presents them to the company, to the media, to the government. And for years, almost no one listens. The company attacks him. The media questions his motives. The regulators investigate him. It seems to prove that in the world of high finance, the system is rigged. And in many ways, it is. But I think that's the wrong lesson to take away. The real lesson isn't about the failure of the system, but about the profound power of independent thought and unwavering integrity. David Einhorn didn't set out to be a crusader. He set out to be a good investor. And being a good investor requires one thing above all: seeing reality for what it is, not what you wish it to be, or what other people tell you it is. He saw a company whose numbers didn't add up. The story they were telling the world was inconsistent with the facts he was finding in their own documents. And instead of ignoring that inconsistency, as so many others did, he asked a simple question: why? That question led him down a rabbit hole that consumed nearly a decade of his life. What he found was that an entire ecosystem of analysts, auditors, PR firms, and even regulators had been built to protect the company's false narrative. It was easier for everyone to believe the simple story that Allied was a great company and Einhorn was just a greedy short seller than to engage with the complex and uncomfortable truth. This story is a powerful reminder for all of us, especially if you're young and just starting out. You'll constantly be presented with popular narratives, with expert opinions, with what everybody knows to be true. But true wisdom, true success comes from having the courage to do your own work, trust your own analysis, and question things that don't make sense. What can you do with this today? First, practice the art of first principles thinking. When you're told something is true, ask yourself, how do I know this? What's the raw evidence? Don't just accept the conclusion, examine the premises. Einhorn didn't trust analyst reports. He built his own database from scratch. That's the mindset. Second, understand the power of incentives. Einhorn saw that Wall Street analysts had powerful incentives to keep Allied happy because Allied paid them millions in fees. The regulators at the SBA had incentives to look the other way because BLX was making them look good by pumping out loans. When you understand what motivates people, you can better understand why they act the way they do, and you can better judge the quality of their advice. Finally, this story teaches us about persistence. Einhorn could have given up at any point. He could have covered his short position after the first wave of attacks. He could have walked away when regulators turned against him. But he believed he was right, and he refused to be silenced. There will be times in your life when you're fighting for something you believe in, and it will feel like you're completely alone. This book is a testament to the fact that if your work is sound and your cause is just, the truth will eventually win out. It may take a lot longer than you think, but it will win. That was a summary of Fooling Some of the People All of the Time by David Einhorn. We've journeyed through the main narrative today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only take you so far. The real power of this book is in the details, the blow-by-blow account of meetings, letters, and transcripts. It's in the quiet moments of frustration and the sudden breakthroughs of a detective on the trail of a great crime. This summary is designed to help you decide if this story is worth your time. If anything we've talked about today has resonated with you, the search for truth, the fight against a broken system, the anatomy of a financial fraud, then I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just learning, It's an experience that will genuinely change the way you see the financial world and the people who inhabit it. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful ideas to more people. Let's keep growing together.